So I guess we're still waiting for people because the door's open, but it's almost time to start. Does anyone have a lot of trouble installing the libraries, or are most people partway there, almost there, mostly there? Mostly there, yeah. There's a volunteer helper, Chris, who's he'll be able to walk around if issues crop up. But hopefully it's not too bad. All right. Well, maybe I'll get going because it is about time to start. So there's a few different options for following along. Hopefully most of you have been able to install the various dependencies yourself. The whole tutorial is basically one Jupyter notebook or IPython notebook. So I'm just going to scroll down that notebook as I go through and basically execute the code. And I tried to keep most of the imports at the top level. So if that first cell there gives you issues, then there might be some parts of the tutorial where you have problems. So hopefully you can execute that cell and import everything properly. If you really can't install the libraries for whatever reason, you could also just install the Jupyter notebook and follow along statically. Obviously, the disadvantage there is that you can't actually execute the code yourself and play around with it, which most of you would probably want to do. But that's an option, just in case you want to be able to scroll yourself as opposed to just watching the screen. Similarly, GitHub now renders the HTML version of the IPython notebook file, so you could just click on that if you go to the GitHub page, which is here, so github.com/TylerJReddy. PyCon 2016. So if you go there, you could click on the IPython notebook, and that'll be rendered automatically in HTML. The drawback there is that you're depending on the internet connection, and it's also static, so you wouldn't be able to execute code. But just if you need to scroll yourself, you can't execute the code. That's an option. I don't think anyone will do this, but I did make a Docker image, which should execute okay. But except for the JavaScript, so there's a few widgets here and there that won't work properly in the Docker image, but beyond that, you should be able to execute everything else. So there's a few different options, and hopefully those are mostly working for everyone. So I'm just going to start off by, I have to tell you a few housekeeping things first. So there's a survey link, which doesn't work for me. They just gave it to me. It's right here. So this is the survey link. So just feedback about the tutorial, if it was good or bad, and those sorts of things, and how it could be improved. There's also, apparently in the guidebook mobile app, there's a way to provide feedback there if you're using that. The break, because it's a 3-hour tutorial, which is quite long, it will be after 1 hour and 40 minutes, so at 3 p.m., so 15 to 20-minute coffee break. And just share the power outlets if there aren't enough. Hopefully there's enough for everyone to get by. So that's all the housekeeping stuff they gave me. So I'm going to jump right in. So what is computational geometry, and why is it important? So the definition, it's basically the study of computer algorithms that perform geometric operations. Because the word algorithms is in there, I'm going to have a few asides about things like time complexity, the amount of time it takes to execute a given algorithm. But beyond that, the main focus is performing geometric operations, many of which are useful for real-world applications. So computer graphics, not just gaming, but also sort of scientific visualization. It's very important for what I do in computational biochemistry. Computer-aided design and drafting, so this is a really big one in industry. So there's entire classes on using CAD, and a lot of that is based on fundamental computational geometry. Robot motion planning, especially collision avoidance, if you want to find the shortest path around a very complicated obstacle, that can often be done using computational geometry. One of the major things that people email me about is geographic information systems. So I'm looking at, for example, the surface of the Earth and trying to figure out the surface area of a given country or a subsection of a given country. Even things like search and rescue and retrieval operations on the surface of the Earth, airspace territory assignment and making sure that there's no problems there. We're always hearing about sort of airplanes sadly falling out of the sky, and it can be hard to sort of figure out exactly where they are and where the wreckage is. So I think computational geometry still has a sort of very useful role in those sorts of things. Computer vision, so things like facial recognition, 3D reconstruction. My own field of research, so computational biochemistry and virology. Viruses are roughly spherical objects. Planets are often also roughly spherical objects, so sort of parsing their properties. If you wanted to calculate, for example, the surface area of the methane lakes on Titan, for example, you could use this sort of thing. So very big things like planets and also very small things like viruses, as long as they have these sort of similar shapes, like spheres, for example, there's certain algorithms that can be used to parse out the properties of those objects. Epidemiology, so water source contamination. And in fact, one of the first applications of computational geometry was actually used in epidemiology about 150 years ago in London. And we'll actually do that. We'll actually execute that code today using a Voronoi diagram. Ecology, so if you have sort of observations about where a certain animal, a certain species was observed over time, you accumulate that over a few years, and you can sort of build a sort of boundary over the habitat of that particular species. Integrated circuit design, I don't know much about that, so I can't really say much about that, but that's one of the ones that was mentioned. Economical construction of physical networks. So if you were building like a really big computer network and you were connecting those computers with really expensive wiring, for whatever reason it's really, really expensive, you want to figure out the cheapest way, the minimum amount of network wire to use, and the proper topology for connecting all of the machines. That's a problem that computational geometry is well suited for. And even cooking ingredient logistics, so if you had a certain set of ingredients available to you, you could put the different amounts that you have available within a convex hull, so you could have basically a whole bunch of recipes that define what's an acceptable amount of each ingredient, and then that could give you sort of success polygons in terms of which recipes you'll actually be able to make with what you have. And it's a relatively young field, with modern computational geometry starting less than 50 years ago. One other thing I should mention, so the general outline of the talk is based on this textbook, so Discrete and Computational Geometry by Devadas and O'Rourke. That's a language agnostic textbook, so I didn't take any code from it. They're just very useful concepts. So I've taken a lot of what they have in that textbook as guidance for how to structure the talk. So I'm going to start off with polygons. And I think polygons sort of fall into the category of things that you sort of know it when you see it. But believe it or not, there's a bit of controversy about the sort of formal definition of a polygon. And the one provided in this textbook is effectively, it's a closed region of the plane bounded by a finite collection of line segments, forming a closed curve that does not intersect itself. So just going to the end of the definition, this is really important, that it doesn't intersect itself. And this is something that pops up quite a lot in computational geometry calculations. So if you have a polygon that intersects itself, so you have the same data points as a square, but they're fed in the wrong order, that can cause a number of issues. If you're trying to calculate surface area and that sort of thing, you really want to make sure that the vertices are ordered in the correct fashion. So this example here is just to sort of emphasize some basic properties of polygons. I'm using matplotlib for all of the plotting and the tutorial. And I have basically setting up two NumPy arrays of vertices and just very carefully making sure that they're in the correct order. There are algorithms to sort of sort the correct orders based on, for example, angles from a certain reference position. But in this case, we're working with a square, so it's relatively straightforward. And then I've intentionally made a 4-vertex polygon that has swap 2 of the vertices to force a self-intersection. Matplotlib has these polygon patch objects that you basically feed in the NumPy array of vertices, and then it'll add that to the plot. So formally, we have these edges. The straight lines in the polygon are called edges, and the vertices, the corners are called vertices. We generally assume that the vertices are bends, so that you don't have, for example, a straight line with a vertex and another line after that. So we generally assume that there's a bend at each vertex. So if there's self-intersection, it's not a polygon. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that it's fairly straightforward, at least intuitively, to suggest that all of the points inside the polygon are separate from all of the points outside of the polygon. But actually, it turns out that from a formal standpoint, that's a non-trivial thing. So for example, there's the Jordan curve theorem, which basically says that in formal mathematical language, and I won't try to prove that, but it is a really sort of fairly challenging proof, even though it's relatively obvious sort of by visual inspection that of all the points in the plane, there's basically two sets. There's the sets inside the polygon and the set outside, and those are separate sets. Now, from a computer sort of graphics standpoint, if you wanted to figure out if a point was inside a polygon, so this is a really sort of classic problem to deal with. For example, if a user is using a sort of a painting program and they click inside the polygon, how does the computer know that that person clicked inside the polygon as opposed to outside it? And the computer might then decide if it's going to fill the polygon with color or fill the outside with color. So there's more than one way to do this, but one of the sort of classic approaches is to basically to draw a line or a ray off to infinity from your point. So if we just pretend that this, where the head of the cursor is here, and you draw a line from the head of that cursor off to the top left, so off in this direction up here. So as long as the line is not parallel to any of the edges of the polygon, it's valid for use in this test. And what we want to do is we want to count the number of times that that line crosses through the polygon. So we're outside the polygon to start off with. The computer doesn't know that. And then we cross this first edge here, so that's 1. And then we cross a second edge here. So that's an even number of crossings. But what if we decided to go in the other direction? Well, we would cross 0 polygon edges. So we would say that's also an even number of crossings. So that is basically the even is outside. And then if we imagine a case where now I've moved the cursor inside, so our point is inside the polygon. Again, the computer doesn't know that. It can't see it in the way that we can. If it tries to draw a line to the top left again, it crosses an edge only once. It goes off to infinity. It never encounters another edge of the polygon. If you try to draw the line to the bottom right, again, it crosses an edge once, and then it goes off to infinity. So the computer knows that it's inside of the polygon because it's an odd number of edge crossings. So that's not the only way to do that, but that's one of the sort of classic ways to do it, and it's still used in modern programs. I think Adobe Illustrator uses that to this day. So every polygon has a triangulation. So that's an absolute mathematical fact. So if we look at this square right here, we can imagine, for example, a diagonal going from the top left to the bottom right, which would split the square into two triangles, which is a triangulation, or another triangulation where we go from the bottom left to the top right. So the textbook defines some useful definitions. I think this is relatively obvious, but a diagonal is a line segment that connects two vertices, so any of these black points here, without sort of leaving the polygon. So from here up to here, or from here down to here. And it doesn't touch the perimeter except at the endpoints. And a triangulation is a decomposition into triangles by a maximal set of non-crossing diagonals, so that the diagonals can absolutely not cross. So I've set up an interactive example here, and this is using basically two polygons with 4 vertices, but in a different arrangement. So there's one polygon that has a sort of convex structure here, and another has a concave structure over here. So the idea is I'm just going to try to intuitively demonstrate that it's likely that every polygon is a triangulation and not try to formally prove that. So just execute it again. And the basic procedure to sort of intuitively understand that every polygon is a triangulation is to start off with the bottommost point in your polygon and then look at its 2 neighbors. So this point here has a neighbor in the top left, a neighbor in the top right. And then to draw a line that is parallel to the line that connects those 2 neighbors. So I've made it quite easy for myself here. It's just a straight horizontal line. And then what you want to do is shift that line up, move out the polygon until you encounter a point other than the one that you start off on. So I have a somewhat staggered animation here. Just slide it up to the point where you reach the next. So here we simultaneously encounter 2 points. And it so happens that the line that connects those 2 points is a diagonal. So it's connecting 2 vertices of the polygon without touching any other part of the perimeter. So that's a triangulation. That's a valid triangulation. We have a triangle up top and a triangle on the bottom. You can also imagine another triangulation from this top or another diagonal from this top vertex to the bottom vertex. But now let's try the concave case. So again, we have a neighbor. We start off at the bottom vertex here, and there's a neighbor on the top left, a neighbor on the top right. And again, I've made it fairly easy for myself. So again, the line that connects those two vertices is just a horizontal line. And we're going to, again, try to slide up this line until we encounter, oh, I've gone too far. So when we first encounter a new point, if it's not a valid diagonal, so here we only have one point, then we connect that new point that we encounter with the original vertex that we started off with. So I've just added a checkbox for that there. So now we have two triangles here, one on the left and one on the right. So just to imagine this from a more general standpoint, so it was pretty straightforward for the convex case, maybe a little bit more complicated for the concave case. And now imagine if we, for example, moved this vertex here anywhere to the right or anywhere to the left, or moved any of these two neighbor points up and down. Can you imagine any case where that doesn't work? And I certainly can't. So I think that's not a formal proof, but it's just sort of a demonstration that yes, every polygon can be triangulated. And that's a really useful thing, because calculating the surface area of a triangle might be a lot easier than calculating the surface area of any arbitrary polygon. But you could basically calculate the triangulation of any arbitrary polygon and then sum together, for example, the areas of all of those constituent triangles. So being able to triangulate something is quite important. It's worth noting that so the 3D generalization of the polygon, so the polyhedron, not all polyhedra can be tetrahedralized. There's actually a number of examples of polyhedra that can't be tetrahedralized. Probably the most famous one is the Schoenhardt polyhedron, so it's a fairly small polyhedron that can't be tetrahedralized. So we actually know the exact number of triangles that are produced from a triangulation of a given polygon. And it turns out that that number is n minus 2 triangles. We can see that fairly straightforward here, right? So we have 4 vertices and 2 triangles, and again, 4 vertices and 2 triangles. And there's also one less than that diagonals, so n minus 3 diagonals. So where n is the number of vertices or the number of edges. So the number of edges and the number of vertices will always be the same for these polygons. So we're going to learn about a few new Python libraries here. And we'll also deal with triangulations in a lot of detail later when we switch from polygons to point sets, where we're going to use a specific type of triangulation, in this case called a constrained triangulation. So we're constrained to a polygon. And it's available in this famous triangle library, which was written in C by Jonathan Shuchuk, who's a Canadian professor at UC Berkeley. And Python bindings, the open source Python bindings, just a light wrapper over that, were written by Dazeli Rufat. So that's available on GitHub. So this is one of the I had actually never used this before, but it's actually a really popular library for doing constrained triangulations. And so I picked two cases for doing the constrained triangulation. And one of them I thought it would be nice to, because we're in Oregon, to actually take the shapefile data for Oregon. So if you don't work in geographic information systems, and I don't either, they have these things called shapefiles, which have a sort of mixture of, it looks like a mixture of metadata and also the actual coordinate data. So you have data about, for example, what kind of data it is, what state does it correspond to, is it projected coordinates or is it exact coordinates on the surface of the Earth? In this case, we're dealing with, as I understand it, projected coordinates, so they're sort of approximated to be planar, so we can deal with a planar two-dimensional case. So there's this PyShape library, which has imported as shapefile. So there's a shapefile reader, and we're reading in the shapefile data for the United States in 2015. I basically iterate through the shape records in that object, look for the Oregon string, and then pull out the vertices and convert them to a NumPy array. And actually, the first time I did this, it didn't work because some of the points were roughly collinear. They were basically in a straight line, and that caused some issues with certain computational geometry algorithms. There's a concept of general position that I'll talk about a little bit later, but basically there are certain pathological properties of input data sets, which basically never happen if you have a random set of points, but actually with real-world data, you can often have problems where you have to initially filter your data for these problematic points. So I basically just looked for x coordinates. You can see here x coordinates or y coordinates that were within about 1,000th of a unit and didn't include those. I figured I'd still get a pretty good outer perimeter of Oregon if I ignored those points, and you'll see that I did. So I also wanted to just check the shape. So we have 214 rows of two-dimensional XY data for the Oregon perimeter data. And the other thing I wanted to, and I'll just to show you, just to skip ahead, so it does in fact look like a reasonable approximation of the perimeter of Oregon. And the other, I wanted to also do an example that had a lot more vertices. And so I decided to pick this really exotic polygon called the 65,537 gon, which the German mathematician Hermes worked on for 10 years in a 200-page manuscript. So he's basically just describing how to produce this polygon with nothing more than a compass and a ruler. And that's what he did for 10 years. And we did it in a single Python function fairly quickly. So the idea is to triangulate these two. Again, I'm not going to formally prove that you always have n-2 triangles in a polygon, but I've written this code that uses the triangle library that I just discussed to perform a constrained triangulation of these two polygons. This isn't a sphere, by the way. It looks like a sphere, but it's just because it's a regular polygon with so many vertices that it looks to the human eye like a sphere, but it's not. And a sphere, in fact, is not a polygon. So we're going to use this triangle library, which I've got, where is it? Right here. So I basically produced a dictionary of data, because that's the required input for the triangle library. And this is basically, it requires the indices of the segments, so the line segments that connect all of the points in the polygon. And it also requires the vertices, as you'd expect, so the original data points. So the original data points and how they're connected are basically the two inputs. So we feed that into the triangle library with this triangulate function. It also requires this string p. So this is apparently just to tell triangle that this is in fact a constrained triangulation of a polygon. Just a few checks. I'm going to print out the number of triangles in these two systems, the result of the triangle library. Let's see what happens if I triangulate Oregon. So it says, okay, so yes, we have 214 original data points, and the number of triangles is 212. So that's n-2. You probably can't see all 212 triangles here, so I suspect some of them are really, really small. But you can certainly see that there are a lot of triangles there. And now let's try to triangulate the 65,537 gon, which might take a little longer. And we can see that there are, in fact, 65,535 triangles. So it's n-2. And for that, you definitely can't see most of the triangles. You can only see a very small subset. They appear to sort of radially get smaller as you move around. So okay, I haven't formally proven it, but hopefully I've convinced you that it certainly seems that for both a real-world case and for a borderline, very artificial case, we're still getting n-2 triangles. So that, if you're doing some kind of custom computational geometry coding of your own, you want to unit test certain properties. Certainly n-2 triangles from a triangulation is a very robust test to have. So that deals with the number of possible triangles, the number of triangles in a triangulation. But how about the total number of different triangulations? So how many different configurations can we have? So we already saw earlier with just with n equals 4, so 4 vertices, that we can have this diagonal going left and right or up and down. So that's 2 different triangulations for a polygon that only has 4 vertices. And the same thing for a square, right? So there's 2 diagonals in the square. So it turns out that there is an equation for figuring out exactly how many triangulations there are for a convex polygon. And the textbook provides a definition for the convex polygon. I think it's something, again, that for the most part you know when you see it. But effectively, every pair of non-adjacent vertices has a diagonal, or all of the non-adjacent vertices can see each other. So you can draw a line between those two vertices. And then, so there's this Catalan number, which is named after the mathematician Eugene Catalan, Belgian mathematician, which basically tells you the exact number of triangulations for convex polygon. But for concave polygons, it's more complicated. So in that case, you only get the upper limit. So there's always more possible triangulations in a convex polygon than there is. And you can never have more triangulations of a concave polygon with the same number of vertices than you can with a convex polygon. And one of the sort of confusing things about this Catalan equation is that it's for a polygon with n plus 2 vertices. So for a square, for example, even though it has 4 vertices, you would use n of 2 because it's for n plus 2. I find that rather confusing. So when I defined the Python function, I basically wrote it to subtract 2 from the number of vertices that are input. So you would still call it C2, but in fact, for programmatic purposes, we can just feed in the 4 vertices. So you can see we get a big number. I'll just execute that again. But yeah, so the Catalan number for 65,537 vertices is quite large. So you can get a lot of different possible triangulations. And the situation is even more complicated when you're not constrained to a polygon, as we'll discuss later. That's a really large number. There's no way to really intuitively know if that's correct. So I also have a simpler example here where we feed in a polygon with 4 vertices into the equation, and we get that there are two possible triangulations there. And that matches with intuition. So again, I haven't formally proven it or derived the Catalan equation, but at least it sort of makes sense in terms of intuition. It looks like it's working there. So again, from a sort of unit testing standpoint, if you're working with concave polygons, which are maybe a bit messier to deal with in a triangulation context, you at least have a sort of upper bound. So the number of possible triangulations is between 1 and the Catalan number. So we're now going to move on to the classic art gallery problem, which was posed by the American mathematician Victor Klee a few decades ago. And so he actually, most of his research was done not far from here. So he was at the University of Washington in Seattle for 53 years, so quite a long time. And the question is, what is the fewest number of stationary guards, or you can even imagine surveillance, like CCTV cameras that are capable of rotating 360 degrees, placed anywhere inside a polygon that can basically cover the entire thing. So how many guards do you need to cover any arbitrary polygon? It turns out that many versions of the problem are basically algorithmically intractable. So they're sort of the lingo is that they're NP-hard problems. But we do know some things about sort of the limits and the always sufficient number of guards. So we know that floor, so the largest integer that's less than or equal to n over 3, where n is the number of vertices or edges in the polygon, that's always sufficient to cover the entire polygon with guards or with video cameras, or if you're trying to spread some signal that requires line of sight everywhere in the polygon, that's always sufficient. It turns out that protecting the exterior, which is called the fortress problem, is actually much more difficult. So you need the largest integer that's greater or equal to n over 2 guards. So that's always sufficient and sometimes necessary. But the problem here is that if someone gives you an arbitrary polygon, an arbitrary building layout, and says, is X number of guards or X number of cameras sufficient, that problem is NP-hard. So you can relatively easily get to the number that would be sufficient, but you can't know if that's the optimal number in many cases. So I think this is a lot easier with examples. So I start off with a pentagon, and we're looking at both the fortress problem and the max guards for guarding the interior problem. And we get values of 1 and 3. And I think you can sort of intuitively guess that 1 is a reasonable guess for the regular polygon, because that one guard standing in the middle of a regular polygon can see all of the corners and all of the edges just by turning around. And so we have here, so a single guard. I just put G1 here inside this pentagon. I think it's fairly clear that that guard has line of sight, assuming that the guard of the camera is capable of 360-degree rotation to all points inside the polygon. But if we look at trying to guard the exterior of this same polygon, it looks like we need at least 3 guards, right? So there's one guard here who can see sort of this edge here and this edge here. There's another guard over here who can see just this edge here and this edge here. And there's one guard here who can see these 2 edges. But you might be thinking that I've messed up and that actually this guard here, we could move this guard up to here, right? And then they'd be able to see this edge and this edge. But what does that accomplish? So we can't move this guard, at least as far as I can tell, we can't move this guard to any position such that they can cover this edge and a 3rd edge. So it seems that in this case, the values that we get, so 1 guard for the interior and 3 guards for the exterior, those are actually the optimal values. So for the pentagon, the values that we get out, the always sufficient values, are also the optimal values. But let's try something a little bit harder. So we'll move up, we'll just add 1 more vertex. So we'll go up to the hexagon now. So focusing on the number of guards required to deal with a hexagon. And I think I've got 2 different kinds of hexagons. So hexagon 1 here and hexagon 2 here. If we take a quick peek at them, one of them is effectively this regular hexagon here. And already you can probably guess that a single guard would be sufficient there. You put 1 guard in the center, for example. You put 1 guard anywhere inside of that polygon and they'll be able to see the whole thing. But in this case, I think you can probably guess that if you try to put a guard, for example, down here, they won't have line of sight to the top left, or same for the other side. So there's actually, there are formal proofs for this, and actually, we're actually going to get pretty close to proving it thanks to the brilliant work of Steve Fisk, who was also an American mathematician. And the idea is basically again, we're going to use the triangle library that I was talking about before. So basically triangle.triangulate, again, feeding in the edges and the vertices of the first hexagon, and doing the same thing for the second hexagon. And basically just plotting those triangles. So now we're using these matplotlib poly collection objects, which are useful for plotting the polygons, especially if you have more than one. So if you have like thousands of triangles, it's better to add a collection of triangles in matplotlib as opposed to just trying to do a Python for loop and adding them one by one, which can get really quite tedious and quite slow. And then we're also going to basically color the triangle vertices. And this is the sort of the Steve Fisk algorithm. So what you basically want to do is you take your triangle. So here there's 4 triangles. Again, 6 vertices and -2, 4 triangles. And color each vertex a different color. And you only have 3 colors for your entire polygon. So have red, green, and blue for every single triangle. So hopefully you believe me that there's red, green, and blue, and no color is ever repeated in a given triangle. And so that's the first step. You triangulate it. In this case, we've used the Python wrapper to the triangle library. And then you assign those vertex colors. And then the next step is to look at the least frequently occurring vertex color. So in this case, we have 2 greens, 2 blues, and 2 reds. So 2 is the smallest, the lowest frequency of occurrence for any color. So that's the number of guards that's always sufficient to guard the hexagon. Now, in terms of, so the equation is the floor of n/3. And if we think about that intuitively, so we've got 3 vertices in every triangle. And each color can only occur once. So this algorithm basically tells us that there's always going to be 1 color that tells you the always sufficient number of guards. So you can sort of intuitively understand that the floor of n/3 makes sense. So if you place 1 guard or 1 color in any triangle, it can always see all of the contents of that triangle. So if we focus on this green vertex here, you can see the guard placed at that vertex can see all of the contents of this triangle and all of the contents of this triangle. So all of the contents of the triangles that it's connected to. And the same thing for this green vertex here. So it's connected to this triangle and to this triangle here. So that's not quite a formal proof, but it's pretty close to getting there. And if we look at this more complicated case over here, we have 2 green vertices 2 blue, and 2 red. So the answer is again 2. But in this case, we actually need 2. So in the first case, you only need 1. So the math will tell you 2 is sufficient. But again, the problem of I have some arbitrary number of guards or cameras that I want to use to guard this polygon, the structure, is that going to work? Well, if it's less than the maximum, we can say that, well, we know it's less than the always sufficient number, but we're not sure if that could actually work. So that's the sort of the gap between what theory can tell us and the optimal solution, which is NP hard. But here, what theory is telling us also matches the optimal solution. You can see that intuitively because there's no way to place a guard that can see into both of these crevices. And if we go to 3-dimensional, so if we move up to polyhedra, so you want to cover the entire volume of a polyhedron, the situation gets way messier. So even if you put a guard at every single vertex in a polyhedron, in some cases that wouldn't suffice, believe it or not. So people actually publish papers with example polyhedra. They're pretty strange looking, but they're certainly there. And that's, so yeah, if you're dealing with a 3D case, that's an issue. So we're now going to transition to, are there any questions about that stuff? That's okay? All right. So we're going to transition to a really, really fundamental thing in computational geometry, which is the convex hull. So if you've ever taken an algorithms class, but you haven't really done much specialized computational geometry, you'll probably have heard of convex hulls, and you'll assume that computational geometry basically means convex hulls. And it certainly is a very important concept. And we're also transitioning to point sets. So up to now, we've been dealing with constrained point sets, basically, so point sets that are connected into polygons. I think it made sense to start off with polygons because much of what we're going to do with point sets is actually break them down into polygons to help us deal with their properties. So to define the convex hull, it makes sense to define convexity. Again, I think this is a concept that sort of makes intuitive sense to most people. It's basically a region is convex if any 2 points in that region can see each other. So you can connect those 2 points with a straight line that doesn't exit the polygon. Or, yeah, that doesn't exit the polygon. The formal definition of the convex hull I find a bit confusing. It's effectively the intersection of all convex regions that enclose your point set. It actually helps a little bit to sort of go back to kindergarten and look at one of these geoboards. Sort of, this is a classic example used in a lot of textbooks, computational geometry textbooks, where if you have some arbitrary point set and you want to calculate the convex hull, what you're effectively doing is just wrapping an elastic band around that point set. So it's the smallest convex enclosure that includes all of your data points. So for example, if you wanted to have the convex hull of this entire board, it would be an elastic band that goes all the way around the entire board. Even in 3 dimensions, you can think of it like a plastic bag. So you have a whole bunch of points in X, Y, and Z. You just wrap all of those points. The convex hull is built out of your original data points, but it doesn't necessarily include all of your original data points. So many of them will be what are called interior points, and the others will be called the points that fall in the convex hull. And we're actually going to jump right in and calculate the convex hull because we have the useful, so scipy.spatial. So this is the sort of the computational geometry library of SciPy, which is quite useful. It turns out that this scipy.spatial to convex hull, so this is what calculates the convex hull for effectively any arbitrary point set in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and even higher dimensions. That's actually effectively just a wrapper to the QHull library. So there's at least 2 major computational geometry libraries written in sort of really low level, really quickly running optimized C code. There's QHull, which is what is used under the hood for a lot of the scipy.spatial calculations. There's also Seagal, which a lot of you have probably heard of, which is super, super fast, but I would say probably a little bit harder to use, and the documentation's a little bit harder to wade through. But those are sort of the 2 major competitors, which are heavily used for doing fast computational geometry calculations. We have a really convenient interface to convex hull. It's also really well documented. So the docstring, as is the sort of ethos for Python to have really nice documentation. It really is pretty good for these functions. So this is a class. So this hull variable here is actually an instance of the convex hull class, which has a whole bunch of attributes. So we can do a whole bunch of different useful things with those attributes. You'll often have to do a lot of data mudging yourself, like look at the indices or break it down into to polygons and calculate their surface areas, and I think a lot of the attributes are quite helpful for doing that. So here we're working with a random 2D array of points. I'll just execute it again, so we'll get a different result each time because it's random. And we actually is a sort of a testament to how fundamental the convex hull is. SciPy actually has a built-in plotting function just so you don't have to write the code yourself. So the scipy.spatial.convex hull plot 2D. It only works for 2D cases. There's no 3D equivalent. But you can just feed in your hull object without doing any other work. So you feed in your data points, generate this instance of the convex hull class, then feed that instance right into the convex hull plot 2D, and you have your plot, which has the original data points, which are in blue, and some of those data points fall in the convex hull, and some don't. So the interior points are inside as well. Now, choosing a random set of points was actually also for my convenience, so that it ensures that the data is not pathological. It doesn't have any degeneracies. And that's a really important thing to remember. If you're writing computational geometry algorithms, you really do have to worry about user input and how to handle issues. Like if you have two copies of the same data point, that's a fairly obvious one, but that's obviously an issue. But also there's problems like collinear points. So if you have 4 data points that have the same x value, even if they have different y values, they effectively lie in a line. And the concept of the convex hull becomes ambiguous in that case, because which of the points do you actually have to connect? You don't have to connect all of them to actually generate a wrapper around the data set. So the precise definition for general position, as I've written here, it varies depending on the algorithm. So certain algorithms operate depending on certain properties of the input data. So they'll have certain limitations in terms of what you can allow. But the point set is effectively always in general position if you choose the points randomly, but that's certainly not the case with real-world data. So I'd actually planned to show you an example of scipy.spatial.convex hull failing with a degenerate data set. And so this is what it looks like. So I've got collinear points at the bottom here, collinear points at the top. So actually I thought this would fail when I fed it in. So if we take these, I've just defined this as the degenerate vertices variable. So try to feed this into convex hull. So scipy.spatial.convex hull, degenerate vertices. I'll tell you about this extra option I fed in here shortly. And then we'll plot it again. So you can see that it actually worked. Python didn't raise an exception when I ran the degenerate vertices through the scipy.spatial.convex hull class. And it turns out that the QHull library is sort of smart enough, it's been written well enough, that it can actually filter out those particular degeneracies in the data set. So they've thought it through quite well. And it actually feeds you back a set of data in terms of the indices of the violating vertices and their neighbors. So that's why I fed in. If you do it without this extra option I fed in, without the QC option, it'll just silently succeed, which is fair enough, is probably what a lot of people would want. But I was a bit perplexed by that because I was hoping to show you that actually it fails if you don't think about your input. But it's just because the developers did such a good job that they've thought about those potential pathological cases. So if you want to know if you were sometimes getting pathological input, you can feed in the QHull options. QC. There's a few other flags that tell you different things, and I think those are now, at least in more recent versions of SciPy, those are reasonably well documented as well. But again, it's important if you're writing your own custom code to think about those sort of potentially pathological data inputs. So the convex hull is really, I think this is the sensible point to start talking about algorithm time complexities, because we want to know how long it takes the code to run, because you can often have an algorithm that's fairly easy to implement, and maybe it has a really useful real-world application, but it takes 7 days to run on a single data set, whereas a much more involved algorithm, you might not want to implement it, but it could run in 30 seconds with the same number of data points. So we do want to have a way and a language to quantify and discuss how long it takes for this code to run. So, and there's probably people in this room who know a lot more about this than I do. I'm a biochemist, but just the sort of short and fundamental concept is that you use big O notation. So we have this big letter O here in the table, and then after that in parentheses you put a function which defines how much extra time is required as you add more data points. So we use n to basically indicate the number of data points in the input data set. So for example, this log linear value here, n log n, it means that if you have 1,000 input data points, you have 1,000 times the log of 1,000 as the sort of the amount of time that it takes. And you switch from 1,000 to 5,000, you follow this function. So you follow the n log n function. For quadratic, you have a sort of a parabolic growth. And then for a polynomial, you have your input data points to the power of some value greater than 2. And then exponential growth, it's even, so you basically want to go higher in this table. You want your big O notation to vary as optimally as possible. So you don't want to consume a lot of time. You want to have a function that doesn't grow super rapidly. So quadratic is going to grow, especially with really large data sets. It's going to take a lot longer to run with the quadratic algorithm than with a log linear algorithm. So for an example of a log linear is sorting a list. And it turns out that log linear is often a really good guess for the optimal time complexity of a lot of computational geometry algorithms. You can often sort of reduce the problem. So the way that you know from a theoretical standpoint that the optimal performance is log linear is that you can actually reduce some computational geometry problems to the equivalent of a sorting problem. So come up with a really simple case, and then you can just say, well, this is basically sorting. So if we reduce this problem to sorting, we're not going to get any faster than sorting. And I'll actually do that for one of the cases. In terms of how you know that sorting is optimally n log n, that's sort of beyond the scope. I couldn't tell you. That's sort of hardcore algorithms type stuff. But if we can reduce it to what's well established as a sorting operation, then we can say with a fair amount of confidence that we have n log n as the optimal performance. So I'm going to focus on time complexity, but there's also, you sometimes have to worry about space complexity, so the amount of physical memory or RAM that's being used by your algorithm on your machine. So you might come up with an algorithm that's really easy to implement because it has copies of all of your data in 3 different places, and that's really convenient. But if you have, if you suddenly have the square of your input data, so your data set increases by a huge amount, even though the code can run really quickly, at a small amount of physical memory, eventually it becomes intractable to run that code on your computer. So I'm not going to talk much at all about space complexity, but it is something to keep in mind if you're implementing something at a sort of production level. So I thought it would make sense, especially in the spirit of an open conference, to see if there are things that we can improve by improve with these tools like SciPy.Spatial.Convex Hull by actually benchmarking their performance, doing a sort of crude. It'll be a crude benchmark, but just to see how well the code runs. So I've set up a few different possible fits to the data: a linear fit, a log linear fit, and a quadratic fit, and then a different number of input points, so varying from say 1,000 to about 1,000,000 input points. I'm going to very, very crudely just basically timestamp, have a list of times and timestamp the data, the start time, use the time module to get the time at the end, and subtract those two. That's certainly not the way that you should benchmark formally, but for the purposes of just seeing roughly how well this runs, you can run that code. It certainly seems to go pretty fast, right? I think less than a second for 1,000,000 points. And we'll use SciPy.Optimize.CurveFit, so sort of a nonlinear fitting algorithm to fit for the various different functions based on the amount of time that it took them to run. So you might get a slightly different result in your machine, but it should follow the same trend. So you might need to change the Y limits because the amount of time it takes might vary. And that actually is factored into these functions with the constant value. So I've added coefficients to these equations. So that's basically accounting for the differences between different computers. But the fundamental growth pattern, the big O notation, or the time complexity, you should have the same pattern. So we can see it's clearly not quadratic. And it's either linear or log linear based on this plot. But it so turns out that QHall, so again, this is just a wrapper to this production C code, QHall. uses an algorithm published 20 years ago, which has log linear performance. So it looks like that we are in fact getting a result that's consistent with what they've published for their algorithm. So there's really not much room for, at least from an algorithmic standpoint, there's not much room for the open source community to make that much better. So it's good to see that we have a sort of really well optimized code being used for that. And just as a summary of, because people have been researching convex Hall algorithms for quite a long time, I just made this short table which summarizes just a subset of the different convex Hall algorithms. There's this incremental algorithm, which is it has a quadratic time complexity, so it's slower than what we have available in SciPy. But it's still often implemented just because of conceptual simplicity. There's also this GIF wrapping algorithm. And the H and the F parameters in the function here, those actually mean that it's opit sensitive. So H is actually the number of hull points. So if you have a larger or smaller number of hull points in your result, that actually affects how long it takes the code to run. So your input data can actually, not just its size, but its properties can actually affect how long it takes that algorithm to run. That's kind of interesting. And then there's the gram scan and the divide and conquer, which both operate at log linear complexity, which is quite good. So no, we really can't do much better than at least from an algorithmic standpoint, than scipy.spatial.convex Hall. And I had mentioned that we can often reduce to sorting problems, just to show that from a slightly more formal standpoint. So I've actually just produced this example here. So if you have these parabolic points, so y equals x squared was used to generate these points in Python. If you want to calculate the convex Hall, I think most of you will agree with me that we've effectively reduced this to a sorting problem. So once we know which points are, as long as we know which points are present going from left to right, we can connect them that way and then connect from the last point to the original sorted point. We've reduced the convex Hall problem to a sorting problem. So it just makes sense that we've reduced it to a log linear time complexity situation. If you're being really difficult, you might say, well, what if we didn't even care about connectivity, so we just wanted to identify the hull points without even connecting them? Can we do that any faster? And the answer is no. And this was discovered actually within the last 30 years or so by these two mathematicians. So you're still constrained to, I won't try to prove it, but they did in fact prove that you're still constrained to effectively sorting, to sorting time complexity. So this is a tutorial, so I thought we'd have some practical examples. I've already filled in the answers. I didn't want to leave it blank, just because it took me actually quite a long time to solve some of them. I think the convex Hall ones aren't too bad, but some of the other examples are a little bit harder, so it just made sense that, if you want to play with it, like take some points out or add some points in, you're free to do that, but I didn't want to sort of stand up here and suffer trying to do some of the more complicated calculations. So it's a somewhat artificial example, but I guess the problem is effectively, so you have a startup that built a long-distance robot, and you want to send it along land from the far west of Oregon to its eastern border. But a sufficient number of Oregon residents have objected to this project, and they don't want you to send a robot through their state. So you basically have to treat the entire area of Oregon as not acceptable for the movement of your robot. But the bordering states they don't mind. So for whatever reason, they've decided to be more liberal. I don't know why. But so you basically plan to either travel on the border, so you might initially guess that traveling on the border of Oregon from the west to the east might be the fastest route, but maybe not. So assuming flat terrain, which is perhaps not the best assumption in Oregon, find the minimum total distance that may be traveled by the robot from the westernmost point of Oregon to its easternmost point. So I'll just go through what I did to try and solve this issue and try to find the shortest Euclidean distance between the westernmost and easternmost points. So basically, initially you just want to find what are the westernmost and easternmost points using this data. Again, this data is from it's the sort of U.S. Standard data from Reddy using the Python shapefile library, and we basically use NumPy to figure out the index of the minimum x and the maximum x values, and then we effectively plot those. So those are shown in red here and red here. So the westernmost point in red and the easternmost point in red. So we've indexed those out. And the other thing we've done, again, we've just generated an instance of the convex hull class using the Oregon vertices as input. And again, we've taken advantage of the built-in plotting, the 2D plotting SciPy spatial convex hull plot 2D to actually draw the convex hull. So basically, the idea is to compare the amount of distance that's traversed as you move exactly around the perimeter, so following the border points, versus following these convex hull paths. So follow the convex hull versus follow the exact perimeter of the state. And you can do that in either a clockwise fashion or in a counterclockwise fashion. We've got 4 different distances to calculate. We've got clockwise perimeter, clockwise convex hull, counterclockwise perimeter, and counterclockwise convex hull. And so what I effectively did is I just I used this SciPy spatial distance matrix, and you basically take all of the data points and sort of shift them. So you have your vertices up to the last one, and then your second vertex, your vertex up to the second last one, and then your second vertex up to the last one. So you've shifted them all by 1. So you basically have a distance matrix, which is the distance between your first point and your second point and your third point. And just sum all those together. There's probably a more efficient way to do it, but that seemed like a convenient way to calculate it. And then we effectively sum all of those diagonal distances. So the diagonal will actually have the off shift by 1 because we've removed. So we start off with a 0 index here and a 1 index here. So the diagonal will actually basically include all the distances between points that follow each other, if that makes sense. So using that approach for both the convex hull and for the perimeter coordinates. The only other thing I should mention is that it's a little bit tricky to do it because we're doing it in 2 directions. Sometimes you basically have to wrap the data, so put the first data point at the end as well so that you have the completed path. So I've basically shown the plot of the paths here, the 4 different options. So this is following the Oregon border in a clockwise manner, and then following the Oregon border in a counterclockwise manner. And the distances have been calculated, again, using that distance matrix approach where you just sum the diagonal. You see they're pretty close. There's a little bit of a difference there. And then doing the same thing with the hull path. So again, we get the indices of the points that form the convex hull back from the SciPy spatial convex hull class. And we plot. So it's obviously a much straighter route, and you might not necessarily intuitively guess that it would be shorter, but you can see here that actually both of the convex hull directions are shorter than either of the border paths. So this is actually a well-known example of basically robotic motion planning. So if you want to avoid an obstacle, you can use the convex hull to find the shortest route around it. So it'll always be the case that with that input data set, if you want to find the shortest route around it, calculating the convex hull will give you one of those 2 possible directions will be the shortest possible direction. So hopefully that's a sort of useful thing. And so the hull path 1 is the shortest. So that's an example in 2 dimensions. But what if we wanted to deal with a 3rd dimension? So SciPy spatial convex hull can certainly handle that, and even beyond 3 dimensions. So I've taken an example from my own research in this case. Basically dealing with a spherical object. So it turns out that the flu virus, so people often get flu shots in the winter in temperate climates, has 2 different shapes, but one of them is spherical. And so I've basically just taken some of my research data, I'm going to plot it here. It's a whole bunch of points. These are all the sort of protective molecules that cover the surface of the virus. So the envelope coordinates, its genetic material would be inside. And the question that we're asking is, what's the surface area of the virus? So can we estimate that? And so one approach to calculating that is to produce the 3-dimensional convex hull, and then basically break it down so we can actually get the facets, the triangles that cover the entire surface of the sphere, and then calculate the surface areas of each of those triangles and sum them together. And that'll give us actually a pretty good estimate of the surface area of that object, even though it's not a perfect sphere. And the same thing could be said. I mean, it doesn't have to be a virus. It could be a planet. Again, any kind of roughly spherical object we could, or really any arbitrary object we could take and calculate the convex hull, and then estimate its surface area based on the breakdown of that convex hull into its constituent simplices or its constituent triangles. So here we've got, again, we're just using the SciPy spatial the convex hull object, and here we're actually doing a bit more manual work. So we're taking the input data points. So flu hull, this is the instance of the convex hull object. We're accessing its points, so the original data points, and then indexing that to the simplices. So these are the indices of the original data points that form the triangles of the convex hull. So that gives us the actual coordinates of the triangles. So all of these triangles that we can see here, those come out by indexing the simplices. So one of the sort of confusing things about using SciPy spatial convex hull is that instead of giving you the actual data, it'll often give you the indices of the data. But that makes sense from a design standpoint, right? So if you have a huge data set, you don't want to store all the coordinates for all the different attributes. You want to store the indices because those are integers, and they'll often be the same integers. So you can have the same data point can be in more than one triangle. So you save a lot of space by using the indices as opposed to the actual data points. But it is something you sort of have to get used to if you're working with the convex hull object. And I'm just plotting them again using Matplotlib poly 3D collection, so we can handle the sort of three-dimensional polygons and plot them that way. And I've also, so it turns out that there's actually, so for calculating the surface area, the total surface area, we could in fact calculate the surface area of every single triangle. So I think you could use probably Heron's formula could probably be used, but actually it turns out that there's a built-in flu hull area attribute, so we can just use the area attribute of the convex hull object. I just wanted to compare the area that we get back from that sum of all of the constituent areas to what you'd get for a perfect sphere that has roughly the same radius. Yes. As long as you have the same vertices, it shouldn't. So if you change the order, I can't imagine that it would. Yeah, if you change the configuration, then it could. If you have an output sensitive algorithm, I don't think that the one that they've implemented is, but I could be wrong. But yeah, I think you'd have to change more than the order. So I calculated crude radius here just by taking the maximum z. So if you think of the maximum z coordinate and the minimum z coordinate, use that to really crudely estimate the diameter of the sphere, divide that by 2 to get the radius, and then put it into the 4 times pi times the radius squared sort of classical surface area equation. And if you just compare the two values, I'll run it again. They're pretty close. So it's about a 97% reconstitution. And that assumes that this would actually be a perfect sphere, which it's not. So that's not a formal unit test, but it does show that the result is actually pretty close to what we'd expect for a sphere of roughly that size. So I think that's quite useful, and that's something that's relevant to society, right? This is a virus that causes illness and death, and again, this extends to any other sort of arbitrary three-dimensional object. So an astrophysics application, and also to our own planet, looking at the areas of different bodies and different things on the surface are certainly quite doable. So I'll now move to triangulations. And this can actually be, so because we're now working with point sets, it can be quite a different scenario than triangulating a polygon. So we have basically, you can actually define it without actually using the word triangle. So it's effectively the maximal number of lines that connect the input data points that don't cross. They're non-crossing edges. Of course, that will give you a whole bunch of triangles, but you don't actually have to use triangle in the definition. So I thought I'd take, this is a fairly simple triangulation algorithm that was demonstrated in the textbook, and actually try to implement it in Python, just to get a sort of intuitive feel for how a triangulation algorithm works. This won't be the most efficient triangulation algorithm, but just to give you guys an idea of what's going on. And we're going to use a lot of the things that I've already discussed. So we're going to try to find the convex hull of the input data set, so the point set S. So that will basically, if we're working in 2 dimensions, that will give us basically the perimeter of the point set, so the convex perimeter. And then we'll triangulate the hull as a polygon. So we'll again use Jonathan Shuchuk's triangle library to get the triangulation of the hull. And then we'll choose all of the interior points, and we'll draw edges from those interior points to the corners of the triangles that they're inside. So that means that every time you have your initial triangulation of the polygon, but then you also have your input points, and those input points will be used to draw even more triangles. And then we basically repeat this 3rd step until we've basically connected all those interior points and generate a whole bunch of extra triangles, and that will be the one possible triangulation of the data set. So of course, it'll make a lot more sense if we actually go through the code and look at the plots. I think I've actually just broken it down into two main steps. There's a whole bunch of plotting boilerplate code at the top. We assume that the point set is in general position, so I think we're actually this point set will just be a random set of points. Yes, so we're going to use a random set of 10 points, and we'll apply this triangle splitting function to those random points. So we effectively just use the triangle library here. So we've got the hull. We calculate the convex hull first. That's fairly straightforward. SciPy to spatial convex hull. We pull out the hull coordinates, which again we use the indices of the vertices here on the points. So that'll tell us which points lie on the convex hull. And then we have the hull coordinates, and then we want basically the connectivity, so the segments, which are fed into the triangle library. So we have this dictionary which contains the vertices and the connections between those vertices, and that's what's needed by the triangle library. Again, we're telling it as we did before that we're dealing with a constrained polygon because we've taken our point set and we've turned the perimeter into a polygon. That's how we start off our triangulation. And we're just plotting them here so that the first step is plotted below. So you can see we have these triangles. And we have the interior points. So those interior points are the ones that are going to be used for producing more triangles. So let's just focus on this point here. So if we just arbitrarily decide to start off with this point, we don't have to, but we could. We would draw a line from this point to this vertex here, because that's one of the vertices of the triangle. And then repeat the process for another vertex in the triangle that contains it. So go all the way up to the top left here. So that'll be our second point, or our second line. And there's one more line. So that we go from this vertex here to the 3rd vertex of the triangle. And you can see it. We'll cheat a little bit and look at the result. You can see those lines drawn explicitly by the code. You can also see that we're getting new triangles when we do that, right? So we get a new triangle here, a new triangle here, and a new triangle here. So the process depends on an initial triangulation of the entire convex hull. And then after that, we iterate through. We go through all these different points. And we just draw edges to the vertices of the triangles that contain those points. It gets a little bit messier if you deal with a triangle that contains more than one interior point. So here you can imagine we could start with either this point or this point. So you could draw, for example, an edge here, an edge here, an edge here, and then you would use the new triangle again for this one. So you wouldn't use the same triangle for the second step. So all this code, this is why I didn't want to try code it live, because it actually took me a while to sort of get all of the indexing and plotting to work properly for that. But we do actually, so similar to the case with polygons, we do know for point sets that the number of triangles that we'll get in the result is fixed. And it's based on this equation, so 2 times k, where k is the number of interior points, plus h, which is the number of points that fall in the convex hull, minus 2. So the sum of k plus h is n, which is the total number of points. However, as before, the number of possible triangulations is a bit more of a difficult situation. And it turns out that even within within the past decade, that's been an active field of research, and all we actually know is that the upper bound, so the maximum number of different triangulations, and you can see that we can get different triangulations, right? Because we could decide to initially triangulate with this point here or this point here, so we could get two different sets of new triangles, depending on the order of the algorithm. So the upper bound is 30 to the power of the number of input data points. That's a huge number of possible triangulations. Now, many data sets won't have that many, but all we can say for sure from a theoretical standpoint is that that is the upper boundary. So in terms of triangulations with special properties and how do you calculate a specific type of triangulation, how do you move between different types of triangulations, it's important to understand the concept of the flip graph. And the flip graph is effectively, it's basically the space of all possible triangulations for an input data set. And it turns out that we know that you can move from any given triangulation to any other given triangulation for a given point set just by flipping edges. So if we look at this at the top of the flip graph here, and then the example, the triangulation that's to the bottom right of it, we can see that one edge has been flipped, right? So this edge that goes from here to here has been flipped. So it now goes from this vertex here to this vertex here. So actually many of the computational geometry algorithms that calculate triangulations with special properties depend on the ability to basically move through the flip graph. So you can progressively flip edges until certain properties are met, certain properties of your data set are met. So it was actually proven in 1971, so really not that long ago that we knew that you could actually traverse the flip graph algorithmically from any triangulation to another. And I guess an interesting exercise might be to write some Python code that can actually generate the flip graph for a given input data set. I'm not aware of any Python library that's actually capable of doing that. So yeah, that might be an interesting exercise, although it could be quite tedious to do. And just as a sort of interesting aside, if you're mostly interested in doing the three-dimensional equivalent, which is tetrahedralization, it's actually not even known if that space is connected. So if you can, in the three-dimensional case, you'd be moving faces instead of edges. It's not actually known that if you sort of incrementally move faces, if you can move from one possible tetrahedralization to another. So discoveries in that area, as I've written here, could actually be quite useful for three-dimensional graphics, dynamic meshing, and that sort of thing. So if we actually knew that, as you do a different tetrahedralization, move from one to another, you can actually just permute those by flipping faces, that would actually be really useful to know. But at the moment, it's not really known. So actually, my table of sort of useful triangulations and their applications is fairly small, but actually contains at least one super useful example, which is the famous Delaunay triangulation, named after the Russian mathematician Boris Delaunay. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that it has a log linear time complexity again. And it's super useful for modeling terrain. So it has a major sort of major application. Generating those topology maps. So you have like a map of the surface of the Earth or a certain geographical region, and it has these sort of bumps for mountains and crevices for valleys. That's effectively extrapolated based on a much smaller number of data points, which are triangulated using a Delaunay triangulation and then projected up to the surface. But there are many of the applications of Delaunay triangulations just start off with a Delaunay triangulation, and then they move to other things. So the Delaunay triangulation is really closely related to the Warner diagram, as we'll discuss later. So Delaunay is super important. There's also this minimum weight triangulation, which is unfortunately is algorithmically intractable, but it would be really useful. I think there are certain strategies for getting really close to the solution. So the basic idea here is that to generate a triangulation which has basically the sum of the lengths of all of the edges in that triangulation is minimized. So it's basically if you have really expensive connections between your nodes for whatever reason. You want to minimize the number of, the total length of connections. You'd want to triangulate in such a manner that that Euclidean distance, the sum of all the Euclideans is minimized. It's actually NP hard, believe it or not. So we should definitely focus on Delaunay triangulations. And so basically, in a really crude sense, you can define it as it's the fattest possible triangulation, the Delaunay triangulation. So it tends to avoid small angles. So if you were to lexicographically sort, I'm just going to try to show, I'll go above here. So let's say we have triangulation 1. These will be the angles of the first triangulation. So let's say we have a list of angles like 0, that's too small, okay. 15, 30, and 55. And then we'll have a Delaunay, which would have, so it has to avoid, so it might have 22. But it actually might be really small here. So the idea is that if you compare these two sets of angles, the Delaunay will always have, from a lexicographic standpoint, it will always have a larger one at the first point of difference. So here we have 22 is greater than 15, so that's Delaunay. And then beyond that, the other triangulation is allowed to have a larger angle. So you always want to sort it so that really small angles are avoided first. So I hope that makes some sense. And just to see sort of what you would get. So if you have these two different triangulations of 4 vertices, so this example here would produce a valley if you project it, and this example here produces a mountain. So it's really important from a sort of geographic standpoint that you use the appropriate triangulation to project up to the surface. So you really want to avoid skinny triangles that have really small angles. I guess, so here you can I think you can sort of intuitively see that the angles here would be smaller. So here and here would be smaller than here and here. So the Delaunay triangulation you can effectively produce it by flipping the edges, doing an edge flipping walk. So if you say that the angles here are smaller than here, we want to flip this edge so that we get larger angles. So it does that progressively to sort it in a favorable fashion. So you in practice you would have far more than 3 angles, and it would typically you'd have several angles that are really, really close, but the Delaunay will be a bit bigger, and then suddenly you'll have one that's actually bigger in the other triangulation. So this probably isn't the best example, but the idea is that you always want to have you'll always have the smaller angle first in the alternative to the Delaunay. So the Delaunay always has large angles at the start, and then it can have smaller angles after. So it tends to avoid those the small angles. I should mention that general position. So you can't have 4 co-circular points. So this is a sort of requirement of the input data. So you do have to filter for that, because that will cause problems. So that is what I've discussed, just going through it, looking at every single triangle and flipping the edges in that fashion. That's actually a valid algorithm, and it'll have a quadratic time complexity. So it's not optimal, but it's probably a fair bit easier to implement than some of the other approaches. But fortunately, people have done some great work, and we have the log linear stuff available from an open source standpoint. There's one other really useful property of Delaunay triangulations, at least one other, which we should discuss, and it's the empty circle property. And what that basically means is that if you take any of the triangles in the Delaunay triangulation and you draw a circle that goes through, which has its basically perimeter goes through the three points of the triangle, so the circumcircle, none of the data points of the original data set will fall inside of any of those triangles, believe it or not. This is just an example. So I've produced 10 random points, so 10 random 2D points with x and y coordinates. And again, we have scipy.spatial coming to the rescue. So we have scipy.spatial.delani, which is, again, this is a wrapper to QHAL. So again, the QHAL C code is running underneath the hood. And we're again producing, this is a class, and we're producing an instance of the class object. So try is an instance of the class object. We also, Matplotlib also has this really useful try-plot for plotting triangulations. So you feed in your x coordinates, your y coordinates from the original data set, and then you take the simplices, the indices of the original data points that fall into the specific triangles, and it can actually use that to generate a nice triangulation. So it saves you a fair bit of time messing around and generating, trying to generate the triangulation. And the circumcenters and the circumradii, it's a bit more of a pain to calculate that. So I've just used something that I've used in the past, a small library. So if we just look at, and this it'll change each time because it's random, but if we look at any given case, so if we just look at the circle here, so we've got data point here, data point here, data point here, but clearly nothing is actually, none of the original green points, original data points are within that circle. And hopefully you can believe me that there is in fact no original data point that falls within a circumcircle. Question, yeah.
So if you do have points that are coded circular, how does that usually handle?
I think you just have to, you have to filter it out. I think the algorithm won't handle it properly. I haven't tried it though. We could try to put in a set of points that are, you're saying if points are square or?
Yeah, let's say you have a set of points that haven't fallen in a circle that would measure it that way or something like that.
Yeah, but I guess that violates the general position, right? Because they're, yeah. Yeah, I think, because you can imagine that you get two triangles that are directly next to each other. And then, I think it's, I don't know what would happen, but.
And with a lot of this stuff, a lot has to do with precision, right? How close do they have to be before?
Correct, yes. That causes issues. So if two of your data points, well, even in the earlier example where I was just dealing with the perimeter of Oregon, I had to filter out data points that were within 1,000th of a unit of each other, otherwise the code wouldn't run. So you do have to be conscious of the floating point fallout, basically.
Yeah, I always want, some of these algorithms say, well, when it intersects, what does that mean numerically? Because sometimes it can be very close.
I agree. I've had problems with it. But yeah, I'm quite certain that 4 co-circular points will cause issues. And yeah, we'll see this again later, but basically if you were to put a point at the center of all of those circles and connect those points together, you would generate the Voronoi diagram. So that's the other reason that knowing this particular property of the Delany triangulation is quite useful. And also a sort of useful sort of anecdotal piece of information is that Delany was a student of Voronoi's. He was Voronoi's PhD student. So close relationships both sort of professionally and mathematically between the diagrams and the people. So we still have about 15 minutes before the break. So let's jump into, if there's no further questions, let's jump into at least a two-dimensional example of scipy.spatial Delany. Yes.
Is the speed of the calculation for the circumcircle, is that one?
Because I wrote it, I'm not sure it's optimal in any case. But I just included it in the GitHub repo. It's the circumcircle library, which is by no means highly optimized. It's just something that I've used in my own research. And when I was first doing this stuff 4 or 5 years ago, I wanted to actually see it to believe it. And I think actually at the time, some of these scipy.spatial things didn't actually exist yet. So the C code had been written probably long before I started the project, but the wrappers in Python are a more recent thing. So I'm not sure how quickly that runs offhand.
Circumcircles to create alpha shapes. So I want to make it faster, so I'll check whether circumcircle.
It shouldn't, but it shouldn't be the rate limiting stat because the Voronoi diagram is also a log linear time complexity and can be generated in that fashion from the Delany triangulation. So I'm pretty sure that it wouldn't substantially change the growth. Like you'd still have the same big O notation if you do it optimally. Otherwise, for and I would take more than log linear, which it doesn't. So that's my educated guess. But I wouldn't use my code without at least proofing it and making sure that there's no faster way to do it. So yeah, we're back to this. I actually had trouble coming up with a really good practical example of the Delaunay triangulation. I don't work in geographic information systems and don't generate those topological maps. And I wanted to have something that was maybe a little more interesting, since I've already used that example. So actually, I did a bit of research and found that if you wanted to basically find the cheapest way to connect a set of nodes, so you're building a computer network, and you want to know the optimal connectivity and for reducing the total amount of wiring that you're using. So there's probably a number of possible applications of that. And this is called the Euclidean minimum spanning tree. So not to be confused with the sort of the minimum weight triangulation. So that would be a triangulation where you have more than one connection between sort of one node so you have one node that's connected to, say, two computers. In this case, you'd only have one connection between each node. And we wanted to know the sort of the optimal way to reduce the amount of wiring in that particular case. So given a set of 25 computers or nodes with fixed positions, like in an office, find the minimum amount of wiring and the appropriate connectivity for the network. This is actually a fairly non-trivial problem. So if you didn't use the Delaunay triangulation, it's a fairly brute force problem. So you would need it's quadratic time complexity. But if you use the Delaunay triangulation, you can reduce it to a log linear time complexity problem. And that's because the Euclidean minimum spanning tree is a subgraph of the Delaunay triangulation. So the Delaunay triangulation it'll have extra, I'll spoil it a little bit, we can look at the answer. So the Delaunay triangulation will have extra connections. And the Euclidean minimum spanning tree is a subset of those connections. So you save a lot of time because there's a whole bunch of this is just one possible triangulation, right? If you imagine that there's 30 to the n is the cap on the possible triangulations. So if you imagine all those permutations as things to consider in your network connectivity, even with a moderately sized data set, the number of permutations for looking at trying to get the minimum weight, so the least amount of wiring, is actually enormous. It's really, really high. So it's a huge windfall that this EMST is a subgraph of the Delaunay triangulation. So we can just do what we've done before and use the scipy.spatial Delaunay class to generate the instance of the Delaunay object, and then use that input, the Delaunay triangulation, into another really useful SciPy utility, so scipy.sparse.csgraph.minimum spanning tree, which I had actually never heard of before I was working on this tutorial. But a valid input for this would include basically an n by n symmetric matrix, which can be generated from the Delaunay triangulation. So if we have, I'm going to try to work through this because it's a little bit hairy to get a handle on the data structure, I suppose. So basically, what you want to do is have a distance matrix. I'll try to see how much trouble I get in if I try to draw it out. But you have so you basically have the indices of your points. So you have your points in the first row, and then you also have, so you have 0, 1. Sorry, I want a distance matrix. So like this, you basically have, for example, if a point can't, generally you don't want to have a point connected to, I should have another 0 here actually. Should I not? Oh, there we go. I think it's starting to make sense. So you want to have, generally a point won't be connected to itself. You can't draw an edge from the same point, right? So you generally expect the diagonal of this input matrix to have 0. So 0 means the points are connected. But also a lot of the points in the data set aren't connected, right? So if we look at this data set, this point here isn't connected to that point, at least not directly connected to the point in the top left. So that's why we actually have a sparse data structure, right? So most of the nodes aren't connected to each other. So a lot of the values in the distance matrix will basically be 0. So that's why we're using this sort of sparse sparse CS graph data structure. So what I basically do is I go through the triangulation and I look for all of the connections. So you say, you look for all of the points in each triangle, so the 3 points, calculate the distances between them, and then fill in the matrix for those triangles. So if point 0 is connected to point 2 in the triangulation, you calculate its Euclidean distance and you put a value in, so maybe it's 1.3. But it's maybe it's not connected to point 1, so you put a 0 in there. And you look at maybe with point 4, it's also not connected, so you might have a 0 in there. So you get a lot of zeros, but a few Euclidean distances, because you're going through those triangles, you're iterating through those triangles. And I've just done it in a for loop. There's probably a faster way to do it, but I've just done it this way, just for clarity. So we just take out those triangle points. You can see I'm basically calculating the distance, so the pairwise distance between the different vertices in the triangle. And then basically, so I've built initially I've just built an empty, so I've been using this sort of fake matrix just to give you an idea of how we're building the matrix. And even in the code itself, I've basically just I've pre-allocated a 25 row by 25 column matrix, and I'm just going to fill it in as I go through. So I pretty much am just doing what I'm showing here, going through and filling it in with the values. 0 if the nodes are connected, and some floating point number, or sorry, a floating point number if they're connected, and a 0 if they're not. So you have the sparse matrix, which basically tells the computer can't just look at it and say, oh, that's connected to that. So it has to have a data structure that tells it which nodes are connected and and what's the distance of those connections. And that's the initial input data. So that'll be for all of the connections in the triangulation. And then what SciPy can do, this special, the minimum spanning tree function can do is take that data, which has more information because it has more connectivities in the final solution, and basically pull out the minimum spanning tree from that using a log linear algorithm as opposed to the quadratic that would be required without initially doing the Delaunay and feeding that in. So here we're actually using it. So the sparse result equals scipy.sparse.cs graph.minimum spanning tree of the undirected graph, which again is just this thing here, which is populated programmatically, this matrix of the connectivities. And there's a bit of extra work here to go through the sparse data structures, and I'm certainly not an expert on sparse data structures, but the documentation is pretty solid on that. You can see I actually had to use iter tools from the Python standard library to sort of unpack all of this. So I have the sparse matrix object, and I had to go through the different objects and the distance to the different indices, and the v, which is the Euclidean distance, or it's the value that's in that sparse matrix. So you can see that if v is basically, I'm just checking. So if v is not 0, then there's a connection, and I want to actually add that into the total distance. So I just initialize total distance to 0, go through, iterate through all of the valid connections. So it has a Euclidean distance that's greater than 0, and add that in. And also, in terms of plotting, we also want to be able to basically only select the values that are connected for plotting them together, so that we can distinguish them from the full set of connections in the triangulation. And I also printed out the diagonal because, again, in this case, because you have a full distance matrix, no point should be connected to itself. So you should always have 0. And so if we look at I've just taken numpy.diagonal of the undirected graph. And we can see that all the values in that diagonal is 0. So I can execute it again. All the values are still 0. Execute it again. All values are still 0. So with the random set, you can see a few different examples. It's performing pretty quickly, getting the result that we want. So I think that's a sort of useful application of the Delaunay triangulation. Yeah. I don't have a 3D example, so I couldn't think of a really useful. I couldn't off the top of my head think of a really useful example of 3D Delaunay triangulation, but I'm sure that there are useful examples for that as well. So any questions about that, or is that's?
So that's the optimal solution for that particular triangulation, but it's not necessarily the optimal spanning tree, I would take there.
No, it should be. So if you have those, so if you just got rid of all the lines and you said those are my input data points, that would be the Euclidean minimum spanning tree. Yes, it would.
I think there's a related problem. In the shortest path network like this that connects all the points might introduce an extra point, right? It's not in the original set. I think you can introduce extra points, you can shorten the distance.
I see. Yes. So the assumption is that we have a fixed number of nodes each at a fixed position. So yeah, if you wanted to, so you're saying that we're allowed to put bends in the edges.
Add an extra point.
Okay.
You get no credit for it, but you can use it. Then I think you can reduce the total distance.
Right. Okay.
So this is the
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and we still don't have an easy way to calculate the minimum weight triangulation either. So this is just for, it's a fairly specific problem. But I don't know. I thought it was potentially useful. So yeah, maybe just one more thing before the break then, and that's just looking at the time complexity of scipy.spatial.delani to see if there's any issues there. You can probably guess that there won't be, because it's built on top of QHAL, which is really well done. I think it's a bit slower though, so it'll actually take maybe close to a bit more than a second for some of the code to run. And again, I'm just doing this very crudely, so just using the standard library time module to do this for a single run. In practice, you should probably do at least 3 repeats for each time point, for each number of input generators. And we'll again use SciPy to optimize a curve fit. It's quite useful for looking at the fits. I guess the other thing worth mentioning is that I think sort of a hardcore computational geometer would actually, you wouldn't necessarily have to measure it this way. I mean, it might be useful to get an empirical value for the time complexity. So we can see here, it's effectively log linear. It's clearly the data points aren't on the quadratic fit. But you'll typically be able to look at the code or look at the algorithm and just say, these are the rate limiting steps. So you know that there's a sorting operation here, there's an addition operation here, and you can just sort of intuitively, if you really know what you're doing, you can intuitively say, this is the rate limiting step, and this is therefore the time complexity of the algorithm. But for me, I find it quite useful. I find that a little bit more difficult, so I find it quite useful to just do an empirical measurement, just to see if it's working, optimally. So yeah, indeed, there's probably not much that we could do to improve that performance. It's log linear, and that's the optimum. So maybe that's a good point. It's a minute away from 3 o'clock, and yeah, maybe time for a break. Yeah, good. So maybe in 20 minutes, I've made good time. So 20 after 3, maybe we can resume for the last bit. Hello.
I'm interested. My name's Daniel. I actually do a lot of GIS work.
Okay, cool.
Geo stuff. I saw this pop up. I was like, oh shit.
Cool. All right, so maybe I'll get started again. So the second last section is on Voronoi diagrams, which is a super important topic in computational geometry. It's not too hard to come up with examples, useful examples for the real world, applying Voronoi diagrams. They were first seriously studied by Gregory Voronoi in 1908, but there's several other names used for them. And we're actually sort of almost moving away from being directly concerned with the input data points and actually being more concerned about the space around those data points. So we're really interested in knowing which points outside of our data set are closest to the points in the data set. So a Voronoi region is all regions of space, effectively defines all regions of space that are closer to your given input point than to any other point. So you end up with a whole bunch of convex polygons in a Voronoi diagram. And each of those polygons contains all the points in space that are closer to that input point than to any other. So if you have a situation where you have a a chain of stores and you want to know which residences are closest to which store, you can use the coordinates of those stores as input points, and then each Voronoi region would tell you which residential locations are closest to a given store. And similarly for network coverage or for problems in epidemiology where you have water sources, which is one of the examples that we'll do, you can figure out which geographical locations are closest to a given input point, which are also called generators. The input points are often called generators because they generate the Voronoi diagram. If you want that kind of information, the Voronoi diagram can be a really useful way to obtain it. And also from the standpoint of trying to avoid obstacles, so if your input points are actually obstacles, the Voronoi diagram can be a very useful approach to avoiding those obstacles because the actual edges, the edges of the Voronoi polygons are equidistant to the obstacles. They're equidistant to the input data points. So that's also another really useful application of the Voronoi diagram. So it's also, as I mentioned earlier, it's the mathematical dual of the Delaunay triangulation. So the Delaunay triangulation Voronoi diagram. Yes, question?
What do you mean by mathematical dual?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I was hoping nobody would ask me that because from a formal standpoint, I can't give you a really satisfactory definition. I can say that they're closely related, and you can perform an operation to convert between the two of them that doesn't change the time, that doesn't add to the time complexity of the algorithm. But from a formal standpoint, I'm probably not the person to give the formal definition. But it's relatively straightforward to interconvert between the two, is one way to put it. And again, because the Delaunay triangulation is really closely related to the Voronoi diagram, it probably won't surprise you that general position or the constraints on the input points is the same. So no 4 generators are co-circular. And before the break, someone actually asked me what happens if you have 4 co-circular points. And just out of curiosity, I just built a square and fed it into scipy.spatial at Delaunay. And it doesn't raise an exception. So I haven't checked what the output plot would look like, but it could be that, again, the developers of QHAL, which is running underneath the hood, were smart enough to handle that gracefully in some manner or other, either by excluding one of the points or simply it's just not calculating the Delaunay triangulation and doing something else. But anyways, if you were curious, it certainly doesn't raise an exception if you put a square in the input data. So people have been studying Voronoi diagrams for quite a long time. A lot of effort has gone into, especially in the 2-dimensional case, into developing optimal algorithms. One of the most famous ones is actually at the bottom of the table here. So it's Steve Fortune's sweep line algorithm, which, as the name implies, actually sweeps from left to right for the 2D planar case. And you basically have the Voronoi diagram developing behind the wavefront, and then you have the other points that are not in the Voronoi diagram aren't included in the calculation until the wavefront actually reaches that point. So I think it can be a little bit tricky to implement, but his code is, I think it's still online, the C code that he used. He works at Bell Labs. I think he still works at Bell Labs, actually. He's a distinguished technician there. But that's definitely one of the most famous algorithms, and that's also known to be optimal, so log linear optimal performance. There's also the incremental algorithm, which, although it's slower, so it has a quadratic time complexity, it is again often implemented because of the relative ease of implementation, basically compared to some of the more sophisticated algorithms. So certainly it's not hard to come up with examples where it's really useful to calculate the Voronoi diagram. We once again can use the super useful scipy.spatial library, and in this case scipy.spatial.voronoi will calculate the Voronoi diagram for any input 2D or 3D data set or a higher dimensionality data set that doesn't violate general position. So this is a classic example. This is the example of the cholera outbreak in London. So at the time they didn't know that cholera was causing deaths, but they had this physician, John Snow, had a suspicion that the water sources were contaminated, so the water pumps that people were using to get the water for the residences. So they basically had a map of fatalities. So these red dots are the fatalities of different residential locations, and the blue dots are the water pumps. And this is the sort of modernized version of the data, which Robin Wilson at the University of Southampton made available on his blog. And so we can basically use these input water pumps. So these are the generators, the input data points for our data set. To scipy.spatial, so scipy.spatial.voronoi, and the array of the pump coordinates right here. Just feed that in. And once again, we get this object, which is an instance of the scipy.spatial.voronoi class. And again, as a testament to how fundamental Voronoi diagrams are, the SciPy developers felt that it was justifiable to actually include an automatic plotting function. So we once again have scipy.spatial.voronoi plot2D, and we can feed in our Voronoi instance, and we can also feed in the axis object if we want to have other things done by matplotlib to customize that particular plot. And I'm just overlaying the fatality data that I've loaded in here. So this is the Voronoi diagram, and there's a few different things to notice here. One is these dash lines that the SciPy plotting implementation has added in, and that is because these generators at the edges, they basically, their cells go off to, you can think of the edges of these cells as going off to infinity. So if you're doing some custom calculations, even with Voronoi diagrams in 2 dimensions, it is important in some cases to remember that you have boundaries, but the edges effectively go off to infinity, so you need a way to close those cells. So you might have to do a little bit of data munging to make sure that you're actually not having a line that goes off to infinity and causing issues in your code. Now typically the edges at infinity will show up with indices of -1. So when you're writing code and you want to do operations on these edges, so you want to constrain the coordinates, you want to put a point here, for example, at the edge of the plot, you would pick that out by looking for the index -1 and then doing whatever operation you need to do with that. So it's just useful to know that. It often causes issues. Sometimes if I don't need these outer points, I'll even just discard them so I can avoid dealing with the boundary issue. So if you're calculating the surface area of this polygon here, you do have to be aware that it's not actually formally closed, at least in this data structure, because this edge is going off to infinity. So again, each of these Voronoi regions, so we have these Voronoi vertices, which are shown in green, the original data points again in blue. So all of the points in these regions are closer to this point than to any other. All of the points that would lie on these edges are equidistant. So the points here are equidistant to this generator, to this water pump, and to this water pump. The vertices, those are equidistant to at least 3 input points. So we have equidistant to this point here, equidistant to this point here, and equidistant to this point here, so at least 3. Now it turns out that actually using that information to try and build a Voronoi diagram is not a good, and this comes back to the floating point issues, that if you try to sort of build these Voronoi regions using Euclidean distance calculations, you'll actually end up in trouble pretty quickly. So you'll often use the duality with the Delaunay triangulation to sort of figure out the ordering of the vertices. Now it turns out that in the 2-dimensional case, SciPy.spatial does a really good job, so you'll get the correct ordering of these vertices. So we again have to worry about ordering, right? So if you want to calculate the surface area of this polygon, you probably want to have the vertices either in clockwise or counterclockwise order. But in so in 3 dimensions, getting the correct ordering per se can be a little bit trickier in terms of avoiding self-intersection. So it's something to be aware of, that you do want to you'll often have code that will give you the Voronoi vertices but not their ordering, so you do want to keep that in mind. Now it turns out that for this particular case, you can see that although it looks like this water pump is the culprit, and in fact it was, they actually had a number of fatalities that these residences, they could have gotten their water from another source, and they just had anecdotal information that actually a lot of the people at those residences just preferred the taste of the water at the contaminated pump for whatever reason. I don't know why, but yeah, it turns out that it was a sort of improperly disposed of diaper that was causing all of these fatalities. So that's actually somewhat controversially considered the first modern application of epidemiology, so using computational geometry to actually sort of parse out information and get epidemiological information from a data set. So I think that's quite useful, and you can easily imagine that these are stores, and you're from a commercial standpoint, you want to figure out coverages for residences, or in biology, this would be, for example, the protective layering of a cell, so the lipids in a cell, the fats in a cell, and you want to know how much space each one takes. There's tons and tons of applications of the Voronoi diagram. Any questions about Voronoi stuff? Okay, so I'll move on to the three-dimensional case. Now, again, I have a somewhat artificial example, but and again going back to drones. So if you have you're designing a drone is the problem, and you want to fly in an urban location, but there's going to be a lot of obstacles. So some will be stationary, like tall buildings. You want to avoid tall buildings. And some will be dynamic. So you might have traffic helicopters that move around both laterally and up and down the sort of z-axis and moving it to different altitudes. And we'll just assume that using a random set of points in 3D is a reasonable simulation for the kinds of algorithmic challenges that we'll have in terms of finding a route that allows the drone to avoid collisions with obstacles. So the basic strategy here is to calculate the three-dimensional Voronoi diagram, which instead of having polygons will have polyhedra. But you still have many of the same fundamental properties. So each of your obstacles will have its own Voronoi region. And as long as you follow the edges of that Voronoi region, you'll be equidistant to that obstacle and all the obstacles around it. So sort of, I think people often don't use Voronoi diagrams for that purpose, but it's actually a really sort of interesting application of Voronoi diagrams. So I'm going to use basically 50 random points in three-dimensional space, so a random sample of points. That also, again, ensures that they're in general position, so we're not violating any of the degeneracies that can pop up. And we, again, even with 3 dimensions, all we have to do is feed the data points into scipy.spatial.voronoi. We'll have to do a fair bit more plotting work because scipy.spatial doesn't have a built-in 3D Voronoi diagram plotting utility. So you do have to sort of deal with a lot more sort of boilerplate plotting code on your own. But again, the attributes are quite useful. So we actually have the ridge vertices at the edges between all of the Voronoi vertices in 3-dimensional space that we can go through. So this ridge vertices attribute of the Voronoi instance. We can plot all of those. So here I'm plotting them in green. So if we go down, basically the green edges are all of the edges of the Voronoi diagram. And the black data points are the obstacles, so the random obstacles in 3-dimensional space. And I've also plotted in orange or in yellow the actual Voronoi vertices. So in principle, the drone could just follow some of those green lines, but as you can see, it's a bit messy. So actually some of these points these edges go off to infinity. We don't have the nice sort of dashed lines that we got in 2 dimensions because we're just doing the plotting manually. And the other issue is that if you wanted to draw some really nice transparent polygons around each of the input data points, which are obstacles in this case, I think you really would have to do a fair bit of work to get those nicely plotted because of the issue of breaking those down into suitable faces, basically. So you'd have to think a little bit. You might have to break it down and sort of loop through the vertices and try to build up a convex hull or some other data structure to plot those.
Specialized libraries for doing stuff like that.
Plotting those polygons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Matplotlib probably doesn't do it so well, but there might be heavier 3-dimensional plotting libraries that can do a pretty good job. So that's one possible application of 3-dimensional Voronoi diagrams. And again, if you wanted to handle those manually, those edges at infinity, they would show up as -1. Yes. So again, I wanted to, just looking at the 2D case, to measure the time complexity of scipy.spatial.voronoi. I think I've already alluded to the fact that it's really similar. Its mathematical properties are very similar to the Delaunay triangulation, so we'd expect it to have a similar time complexity. So again, I've just fed in a number of differently sized data sets, so from 1,000 points to 1 million generators. And again, just very crudely going through, measuring the timestamp before running scipy.spatial.voronoi and after, subtracting, and then appending that to the list. And then we're going to use scipy to optimize the curve fit to fit the data and to see if we do in fact have a log linear time complexity. And I'll run it. It might take a few seconds to run on the larger data sets. And once again, what's going on under the hood is that scipy.spatial is calling QHOL. So pretty much all of the fundamental computational geometry algorithms are basically just calling QHOL under the hood. And on your machine, it might take, again, it's almost certainly going to take a different amount of time, but the growth, again, the sort of the big O notation of the time complexity of the growth curve should follow the same pattern. So it is indeed taking a fair bit longer than for the Delaunay triangulation. So about 15 seconds for almost 1 million points. So it finished there, yeah, so about 16 seconds for 1 million points, which isn't too bad. If we just plot the result, again, just to refresh it, we can see it's certainly not quadratic time complexity, so it's certainly doing better than that. And I know someone asked me during the break about the difference between linear and log linear time complexity. It looks like they're almost the same within this number of generators, and that's true. But if you were to go up to an enormously large number of generators, you would indeed start to see them slowly diverge. But I don't think you want to watch that with me, so I won't do that. But yeah, there is a difference there, and if you could get it to linear, you would certainly want to do that for larger data sets. But again, from an open source standpoint, I think that's excellent. So we don't have to spend any more time trying to optimize that performance because it's at the optimal already. But another thing from an open source standpoint is just that there certainly is a lot of room for improvement and for expansion to do other kinds of computational geometry calculations. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about some of the stuff that I've been doing, some of the things that have worked well, and some of the things that we're still struggling to do from an open source standpoint, mostly within scipy.spatial, but also within matplotlib from a plotting standpoint. And some of you might have sort of really unique skills or opinions on things that we should focus on. And if we're volunteering our time, it would certainly be good to have feedback on things that we should and shouldn't be doing. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that. Maybe you'll have some interesting opinions or questions about some of the stuff that's going on. One of the things that I have been working on for several years actually is the implementation of the spherical Voronoi diagram. So if you have a perfect sphere, or you have a data set that you could at least project to a perfect sphere. So okay, the planet we live on it's not a perfect sphere, but in some cases you could approximate it as a sphere and do calculations on that projected sphere. So obviously from a geographic standpoint, I occasionally collaborate or get questions from people working with GIS software about calculating surface areas of geographic regions or certain parts of oceans, and they want to move their data from commercial software to leverage this scipy.spatial spherical Voronoi code. It certainly can be useful for that. I've also talked to people who do MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging in hospitals. They often deal with spherical objects, so maybe organs that are roughly spherical, and they want to do certain sort of quality control calculations in those contexts. So this was merged in after collaborating. A lot of the sort of code revision was done by Nikolai Nowacek, who's a mathematician that was working at Imperial College in London. So I had given a talk at PyData there in 2015, just sort of asking for input and also looking for people to collaborate with, because I'm not, formally I'm not a mathematician, and it was quite useful. I spoke to a whole bunch of different people with expertise in that field. There was also a Seagal developer in the audience, so he gave us some nice hints in terms of how to work on that particular algorithm, which is it's fairly non-trivial. So this is sort of math literature from the last 10 years or so for doing the spherical Voronoi diagram of the surface of a sphere. So this is the pull request. I think there are about in the end about 9 or 10 different scientists sort of revising that and trying to make it work just right. It should be out probably well, probably at least a few months until SciP 0.18 is out. If you want to run the code yourself, if you want to just use an older version of SciP, that's fine, but you won't be able to run it because it's sort of bleeding edge master branch stuff that isn't available in the normal channels. A few months ago, I had to actually use it in a build process, and I did put it on Conda. If you do use Anaconda to run your Python package management, you're welcome to install it that way. If you do want to try to install and run the spherical Voronoi code. Otherwise, you could also just clone it from the SciPy GitHub master branch and then compile it yourself. Just run set up that Python.build and set up Python install and install it that way, which can be a bit of a pain depending on the libraries that you have available on your machine, but should work eventually if you keep at it. So my specific application was viruses, but there's also, of course, other spherical objects like planets and MRI analysis and so on. The actual algorithm that we ended up implementing has quadratic time complexity, but we know that log linear is optimal once again. There's actually a few different papers that published log linear algorithms, and certainly my initial endeavor was to implement the optimal time complexity algorithm. But it proved too difficult. So even with trained mathematicians, so postdocs who specialize in computational geometry, it just became impractical. We were spending too much of our sort of volunteer time trying to get that going. So the best I could get was quadratic, and well, at least we have something that works as a starting point, and we've got unit tests there. So now, if people who really know what they're doing or think that they could actually get a log linear implementation to work, we at least have the unit test there to make it a little bit more smooth to transition to the optimized code. Just to briefly mention, so one of the log linear approaches is actually to project from the sphere to a plane, to then do a planar Voronoi diagram, then project back up to a sphere, then do some more geometric operations on the sphere, then project back down to the plane and do some more geometric operations, and then project up to the sphere one more time. And the paper claims that it's a fairly straightforward approach, but we certainly had a different experience when we were trying to implement that. So we've put that off. But there's also a sweep line similar to the planar case where you have the sweep line algorithm. So you can actually there's a paper called Sweeping the Sphere, which describes an algorithm for sweeping around the sphere and generating the Voronoi diagram that way. So I think there's certainly potential within the community to improve this, but it might take a bit of time because even with the simpler algorithm, it took us quite a bit of time to get that working in a way that we were happy with. So I'm gonna do a demonstration of it, just using 600 random points. It's worth mentioning that if you're working with a spherical data set, even generating pseudo-random points, so not having points that are biased towards the pole of your spherical object, it requires a little bit of thought. So if you just do it in a sort of naive fashion, you'll often end up with points that are biased towards the pole. So if you want to get a reasonable distribution on the surface of the sphere for your random points, you'll want to pick there's a few different mathematical approaches to doing this. The one that I chose is Marsiglia's method. So Marsiglia was also an American mathematician and well known for this algorithm for generating random points on the surface of a sphere. So I've coded that into Python. There's a number of other possible algorithms. I think this isn't the most efficient one, so there's at least one that's more efficient. But this one was relatively easy to implement, so that's why I chose to use Marsiglia's algorithm for that purpose. So generate the random points using that function, and then some plotting boilerplate, and then finally we get to the point where we actually call scipy.spatial.spherical Voronoi. We try to design it in a manner that's consistent with the data structures and attributes that are available for the already present scipy.spatial algorithms. Obviously, ours isn't written in C; it's written in pure Python for the most part. So it's working a little bit differently under the hood. But we tried to expose the data structures in the same manner that they're exposed from QHAL. So you just feed in your data points. These are the random points in the sphere in this case, and also feed in the radius of your sphere. So again, you need a perfect sphere. If you don't have a perfect sphere, you'll have problems. So you have to somehow have a way to project your data to a perfect sphere. And then the next thing, so that just generates the Voronoi vertices, but not the sorted Voronoi vertices. And actually sorting the vertices of those regions was non-trivial, so we had to look at the Delaunay triangulation to actually figure out how to connect the vertices on the surface of the sphere. So just using sort of Euclidean distance calculations didn't work because of floating point issues, even with relatively well-behaved data sets. So here I'm just iterating through these regions. So we have an attribute called regions, which contains the indices of the data. So we have our vertices, which are the vertices of the Voronoi diagram, and then indexing those to the regions and plotting each one in a different color. You can see here we have, it looks like a reasonably plotted Voronoi diagram. The random set of data points. Can run it again, run it another time. So it actually looks like it's a fairly reasonable result. And so there's, from that's just sort of the starting point, right? So most people won't just want to generate that spherical Voronoi diagram. They'll actually want to do something with it. Often you'll be interested in, for example, the surface area. So if you want to calculate the surface area on a planar polygon, there's a lot of ways to do that, a lot of really good ways to do that. For a spherical polygon, so remember these are actually now, these are curved on the surface of the sphere, right? There's also equations for doing that, but we decided not to include that directly into scipy.spatial.spherical Voronoi because we figured that it was a sufficiently difficult calculation that it should just be done independently. And also because a lot of people probably will have spherical polygons from other applications that they'll want to calculate the surface area for without really caring about spherical Voronoi diagrams. So that's an open issue on SciPy. I opened a fairly long description of what we have working and what we don't. So I think for most reasonably well-behaved polygons on the surface of the sphere, the code will just work. It uses Lulier's formula to do the calculation. And this was based on input from another mathematician, Ed Edmondson at the University of Portsmouth. I think he works in astrophysics. So again, there's a lot of interest from scientists working in very different fields, but who also work on spherical objects. So it tends to work really well in a lot of cases, but there do seem to be issues in certain cases. And I've basically just pasted in a bunch of the test code that we've used. A lot of it's just for doing distance calculations on the surface of the sphere, so you have Haversine distance between different spherical points. But here's the sort of the main function. So calculating the surface area of a spherical polygon, which takes an array of ordered Voronoi polygon vertices, and also calculates the sphere radius. You can see that we've basically pulled the equation straight from Wolfram. So Lulier's theorem is available there. The code is almost certainly not optimal. So there's a Python for loop in here going through the vertices. So there's a lot of opportunities to make this a lot faster. But let's just see if I run the code, and I think what I decided to do was take the area from, what did I do here? So I've got a unit sphere. Polygon areas from above. Yeah, so the example that I did before with spherical Voronoi was done on a unit sphere. So you can see that the radius in each direction is so -1 and +1. So I just want to take all of those Voronoi polygons and sum their spherical polygon surface area together. And that should reconstitute the surface area of the sphere, right? So all of those patches added together should give you 4 pi r squared. So I'll just run that again. But as you can see, they match pretty well. So you're just going through each of the regions in a Python for loop, which probably isn't the fastest way to do it, but from a conceptual standpoint, we can follow what's going easily enough. So surface area is equal to this function that I've just pasted up there, and just keep adding that up. So we initialize it at 0 and just add in the value with each polygon. And just compare the calculated value with the theoretical value, which is just 4 times pi times 1. You can see that the result, it looks perfect, basically. So to a large number of decimals, it's working really well. So we haven't actually opened a pull request yet to implement that for a few different reasons. I think one is there's a few failure cases, and we're not sure about the sort of restrictions. So for example, if you have an entire hemisphere, I think you have issues there. And we're not sure how to sort of formally define what are the limitations. Again, also if 2 points are really close together, again, we end up with floating point issues, but that's maybe not, it's something that's going to happen regardless of the type of calculation you're doing. The other thing is, if it's going to go into SciPy, how is it going to be done efficiently? So, the NumPy and SciPy universal function model is such that you typically have rectangular arrays where calculations run quite rapidly, right? So there's these vectorized implementations. So if we have, for example, numpy.random sample, let's take, say, 25 rows, two-dimensional data. And we'll just set that to a variable. So random data is equal to that. And then we'll use a NumPy universal function, maybe, whoops, what did I do there? So we'll say, take the square root of all the data. So numpy.square root of the random data. So that works just fine. And it works really quickly. It's vectorized code. But now the problem with doing this sort of thing with the polygon surface area calculation is that many of the polygons won't have the same number of vertices. So, maybe this is trivial, but maybe it's not. But it's not immediately clear to me how you would generate the vectorized code that handles the non-rectangular data structure. So you might have, one of these rows in the polygon situation might have, you might have a data structure where the first polygon has 5 vertices with two xy coordinates, and you might have another polygon that has 7 vertices for a 2-dimensional data set, right? Another polygon that has 6 by 2. So you don't have this sort of, if you try to turn that into a NumPy array, you'll get objects instead of this sort of floating point structure that allows you to, or the integer structure that allows you to do vectorized operations. So I'm not sure if it would be relatively straightforward or not to produce a vectorized implementation of calculating the polygon surface areas. But anyway, so that's one of the things that we've been thinking about. So if you have ideas for that, I think we'd certainly be really happy to hear that. Any questions or comments? No. So there's just one final section, which is pretty short, so we've got lots of time if you have questions. But so the other issue is just plotting that data. So the result that we got before looked pretty good, right? So we have, scroll up here. So this looks, at least by visual inspection, you can't easily tell that there's issues with that. So it actually looks like those spherical polygons are actually on the surface of the sphere and properly bending around. But I actually chose to use a fairly large number of generators or input data points to sort of hide the fact that actually we do have an issue there. So Matplotlib isn't doing a great job of plotting those polygons. So we've got an issue and a pull request open. This is, again, Nikolai's doing some nice work to deal with that. So if we go down to 25 points, so again, using Marseglia's method to generate random points on a sphere, calculate the spherical Voronoi object, sort the vertices, and then basically plot them using Matplotlib's poly3D collections, adding those collections in. You'll see that it certainly doesn't look like Matplotlib is doing a good job anymore, right? So when we have less generators, the polygons sort of they have to deal with more curvature. So I think Matplotlib has to effectively break those down into triangles, so do a sort of triangulation and plot it more appropriately. So that's an ongoing issue. And if you look at the doc string for SciPy to spatial.spherical Voronoi, it'll have an example that looks like this, so it doesn't look great. So that's certainly moving forward. That's one of the things that we'd really like to get going properly. Again, as mentioned, there probably are plotting libraries that would do that really nicely already, but I think a lot of the time people will want something fairly lightweight that can do it as well. So I guess our general opinion is that it would be really good to have something like Matplotlib able to do a reasonably good job with that, without having to go to one of the heavier sort of, is it VTK-based libraries. And then the other thing is just that, our planet's not a perfect sphere, and many other planets aren't either. And also, cylinders. A lot of the viruses, like Ebola virus, is not a sphere; it's actually sort of filamentous. It's a cylinder. So being able to do computations on those objects would be really useful, I think, for society. So if we can implement those algorithms into SciPy at spatial or in some appropriate Python library, I think it could potentially be quite useful for society in general. And maybe you have ideas or suggestions for that. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But yeah, that's it for me. Questions? No? Yeah.
So the library that I was thinking of, there's a C++ library called OpenBDB, which basically, if you have a collection of points, it creates voxels around those points, and then
What's it called?
OpenBDB. It's used in computer graphics.
Okay. I'll make a note of it.
Yeah, and it has a way of finding. It's used for finding the closest points to, it's basically used for finding clouds of points that are close to other points.
Okay.
And I think it's also used to generate polygons, because polygons are necessary for computer graphics. So if you have like a cloud of particles that you're using you have particles in, but you actually want to turn that cloud of particles into like a cloud of dust that you can project light onto, then you need something like that.
Okay.
That might be.
Is BDB Victor Delta Bravo?
No, it's voxel database, I think.
Or I'm trying to search it. Is it V as in Victor, D as in
Oh,
Delta?
yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
I wrote it up there, didn't I? Polyhedron. All right. So it's polyhedron plotting. Yeah.
Another potential application of these little Voronoi diagrams or regions or whatever would be is if you were looking at galaxies, clusters of galaxies, you could figure out which galaxy is closest to different regions.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I guess astrophysics is a major application of computational geometry, well outside my area of expertise, but I was happy to collaborate with people on those sorts of things, because often the developments that come out of, say, astrophysics can then be sort of backported to work on much smaller things like viruses that we can't even see. Yes.
I don't mean this as like a sacrilegious question, but when you are working in Python, what other tools do you like to use?
What other tools? I think NumPy and SciPy are the main players. We have domain-specific libraries, like open source libraries that we use to extract data from. So we build these. I could probably even show you if you really wanted to see what it looks like, at the risk of plugging my own research. But
You guys do a lot of feature extraction on your
feature extraction, as in pulling out.
various components of the cells in automatic fashion, like feature segmentation.
Not so much. No, I think that's almost like a vision problem, right? Yeah. So for me, not really at all, actually. So I tend not to use machine learning for most of my stuff. Is just I have a set of point clouds, and I want to calculate its volume or its sphericity, and that sort of thing. But I can actually show you like what we would the type of data that would be generated. So this is the flu virus, which causes lots of problems. It keeps changing each year, and we basically use Newton's laws of motion to watch it evolve over time. So it's actually sitting in a water droplet, because if someone coughs or sneezes, it's basically in water, and it can actually just sort of remain suspended in air, and then someone else can walk by and inhale that, and it'll actually attach to the sugars in your respiratory tract and invade your cells. It can actually survive in water for about 3 years if the water is cold enough, so it can survive for a really long time. So we were interested in knowing, is it the shape of the object changing a lot over time? This is millions and millions of particles, so we needed code that could run reasonably quickly and that could handle the spherical shape. So this is what you can actually see them sort of wiggling and jiggling. That's Newton's laws of motion are driving those particular motions. So yeah, it's not really a computer vision thing. It's more just I want to know how its shape is changing over time. I want to know how quickly these molecules are moving over time. I want to know how much of the surface, these green things are sugars, which are important, for example, for evading the immune response, the human immune response. I want to know how much of the total surface area is occupied by those sugars, relative to the surface area of the sphere proper. And it's not hard to imagine that people looking, from an astrophysics standpoint, that people have, it's a much larger scale, but it's a similar geometry. So you have problems in doing calculations in those systems too. And obviously this isn't a perfect sphere. It's close, but it's not a perfect sphere. So it'd be really useful to have tools that would actually, for example, could you do a Voronoi diagram on sort of any, ellipsoid? Could you actually code that? Maybe it won't work as quickly because you don't have the sort of ideal geometry, but if you could get a way to get that to work really closely, and then I wouldn't have to do all this pre-processing. So there's a lot of sort of pre-processing that happens to project the data up to a sphere because it's not perfectly spherical. And that's only just a few billionths of a second, which took about a year and a half to run. So it takes a long time to run those simulations. That's what I did. That's 3.5 years of my life is that project. But hopefully it's useful to society at some point. But yeah, useful tools it's mostly NumPy and SciPy. Matplotlib I use a lot. We have our domain-specific libraries that wouldn't be of much interest to people outside the domain. But yeah, it's mostly, most people aren't going to be writing low-level C code, and I almost never do. And in the field, it's really important to have. Most people, even if I give them that SciPy, that spatial, that spherical Voronoi that I've implemented, they probably just wouldn't use it. They want to have like a web app that they could just paste the data into, and that's how people are. So fair enough. They're busy solving medical problems, and they don't want to deal with the coding. So. Yeah.
Have you come across any just theoretical or unimplemented algorithms for calculating these things on irregular surfaces rather than like an ellipsoid or some sort of ovoid spheroid, like an extremely irregular surface? The best I've been able to find was the Vincenti formula for distance on a ellipsoid.
Yeah, Vincenti. Yeah, I've heard of that.
Find much for, because you deal with that super irregular surface, and you have to break it down into smaller spheres, and then work from there, and just do a ton of variation.
Yeah, this is a pretty rough surface. I guess you can still, the convex hull is always a good fallback, so that's always going to wrap the data appropriately, but it's only going to give you so much information. But when I talk to mathematicians, they say, "Oh, it's trivial. Just do this, do that." But yeah, I think the issue is just getting it to the point where you don't have a bunch of people trying to solve the problem on their sort of their in-house code, and we just have some open source thing that's being developed, and the efforts are combined instead of closed and hidden from. You avoid duplication of effort that way too. I don't know if it all has to go into Python, but as long as we have a wrapper for it, I think that's good. We don't have to say it has to be Python. And in fact, most of the implementations aren't. Seagal is C, and we're not going to outperform Seagal. We're just not. But it would be good to have at least Python access to all of those utilities. I haven't. I think no. I think we have an ArcGIS person here, but no, I haven't. I guess it's sort of comparing open source to proprietary stuff, and okay, so there's no open stuff too. Yeah, I haven't. I guess there's also Python GIS libraries as well. I think actually quite a few different ones. I think part of the issue there for me was just if I was going to start doing like benchmarks and stuff for comparison, is just it's a little bit intimidating, right? There's all these like different formats and the metadata, and if you don't work in that field, there's actually quite a lot to, at least a lot of initial reading to make sure that you're doing the right thing and retrieving the right data from the right databases. And so.
You made a couple points earlier about the points being at the right direction. I guess it's like, well, what about polygons with holes in them? How would
Yeah.
deal with that? Self-intersecting polygons with holes in them, how that gets broken down. And so much of that has to do with like the encoding of the order of the pixels. And actually, that's the question I have: is how much of this relies on like coordinate order? Because I've dealt with issues where like the left side of a line, how about the surface area of the half of a sphere that's to the left or to the right, or to the north or to the south? I mean, that relies on the encoding of the order of the points. How would that? How can we address that? Those types of issues here.
So you want to calculate the surface area of a hemisphere?
Of a hemisphere, or yes, what is that? Of a hemisphere, but based on like a person's arbitrary knowledge of like what's left and what's right. You know what I'm saying? Of the lines, and you've got that's what I've dealt with in mind. People want to know how much area is the left of their line, but they don't understand that it's actually north or south. That there's.
I'm not sure I get that, but I think hemisphere is inherently problematic. We haven't been able to do. The other thing is, how do you because the hemisphere, you have like an infinite number of points around the equator, right? I'm not sure. How do you define that uniquely or sensibly? I'm not sure if it has to be one of the things that it just outright doesn't do. It just raises an exception because it's not possible, or maybe it is possible and we haven't talked to the right mathematician for that particular issue. But I agree that ordering points is important, and if 2 points are really close together, the ordering often will just fail because of the floating point issues and that sort of thing.
That cluster tolerance of points is an issue.
And the textbook does discuss polygons with holes in them as well. So if you go back to, I'm not affiliated with them in any way, and I assume that many other textbooks also discuss polygons with holes, but I just figured I'd try to keep it. I was confused enough with regular polygons, normal polygons.
You made a comment about the format that a lot of this data is coming in. There's been a big push lately for, not a big push, but a lot of folks are kind of descending on GeoJSON and JSON formats for storing a lot of this type of data.
Okay, right.
Rolling a lot of this out rather than using something like a shapefile, looking at that type of format, straight from the JSON or GeoJSON.
Yeah, there does seem to be some heterogeneity from what I've seen.
The shapefile format's everywhere.
Okay, yeah, it's fairly universal.
Very frequent.
Okay.
A lot of the libraries that you were referring to rely on shapefiles, and the shapefile a lot of their Shapely library. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Shapely, I didn't mention Shapely, but that's, at least for two-dimensional calculations, that can be useful for some things.
That's all Cartesian as well. As long as there's no sphere there, they assume.
Yeah, that's right. It's planar, so.
Also managing depends on the projection that you define.
Yeah, if you can do like an area preserving projection, you can sometimes do really useful things. I think for most of the stuff I was trying to do in a sphere, it would have been really tough to do projection-based calculations. But yeah, I agree. Sometimes that's quite useful, and it's still used for a lot of the shapefile data is for data that's been projected, right? So if you're doing calculations in a single state, that'll often be in a plane which is projected in a sort of rigorous way from the surface of the Earth. Yeah.
That might be an interesting way to address some of those problems, is to take subsets of them and project them so there's less distortion, and then calculate and bring it back into your sphere and unify them all together. Bring it down to a bunch of smaller flat surfaces.
Yeah, people had suggested that. I think I had my mind set on I was gonna make it possible for people to do the spherical Voronoi calculation. I wanted to get that going, but yeah, it's not a perfect sphere. At the end of the day, it's not a perfect sphere. So other opportunities for improvement are always going to be there, I think. Hopefully I don't get in trouble for finishing early. 3 hours is a lot. 3 hours is a lot. So don't rule out projections.
Yeah. So I was like, I don't want to project because there's project it, bring it back. No, it's on a sphere. Shouldn't be that bad.
I have a question about, so yeah, just remind me, you mentioned that, you were recommended to do the project the cloud of points onto a plane and
Yeah.
then do a Voronoi. So, is that, an orthogonal projection, or is it not necessarily orthogonal?
I'm not sure. We could probably look it up, but yeah, there's a paper that describes it in sort of excruciating detail.
Okay.
But I haven't looked at it in a few years. But we tried to implement it over a few months, and we just couldn't. I think just the formal language, right? I mean, they describe it very concisely with just very formal mathematical language, and we tried to spell out the algorithm just in plain language first, and then code it, and it just wasn't working. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure what type of projection it was, but
You can also, in the 2D case, you can also run into floating point.
sure, absolutely, yeah.
Which I would imagine would happen quite often if you're projecting a 3D cloud of points onto a plane.
It's certainly not going to get better, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. It's an issue. I don't think that was. I think we had problems that were more fundamental than that, but certainly that would crop up. I think. Good.